Hello and welcome to the CNBC Africa Special with me, Arnold Segour. The conversation around this today is definitely gender equality. Where better to talk about gender equality than in a country where close to 64% of the people in parliament are women. And to join me talking about this particular conversation is to my right, we have the International Monetary Fund's Human Resource Department Director, that's Kalpana Kocha. Right next to her, we have the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning for the Republic of Rwanda, Honorable Gatete Clapper. And right next to him, we have Miss Isadora Derricks Briggs, who is with the UN Women. She's a representative to Kenya and Regional Director. Many thanks for making time to actually speak to us today. Honorable, I want to start with you. Rwanda has made colossal strides when it comes to gender equality, more women in parliament than Canada or even the United States. And best practice, who's to say that some of the policies that have been deployed here cannot actually be replicated across much of sub-Saharan Africa?
I don't know why you started with me, but thanks so much. I have two powerful women here who are the practitioners who know better than me. But for the government of Rwanda, it's very, very important that we have the leadership that has been really spearheading the whole gender development process that is working for us, at least. When we put the structure in place, at least having a ministry that's in charge, having a gender monitoring organization that is there, and having, of course, also the forum for parliamentarians, in addition to the whole groups of the Women Council that cuts across in all over the country, has been very, very helpful. But I think what yielded results was the laws that have been reformed, the policies that have been put in place. Everybody can see the results. And those results are really an encouragement for us because we are all the beneficiaries of those kind of reforms that have taken place. In the last conference, we were talking about, for example, the issue of access to land, the women having access to land and also owning the land itself, which has been very, very important. Initially, they were not allowed. They were not even allowed to inherit any of the properties. But when the land law was put in place that is allowing them, we saw that within a very few years, we could see that the land that was jointly owned was 54% of the total land in the country. But for women, owning land alone was 26%, as against the 18% for men. And you could see that has really changed the dynamism, because women this time could just have their own assets and be able to pledge them for collateral when they are looking for loans. This has encouraged their own access to financial services. In addition to the decision taken by the government, also to provide resources in the BDF, the Business Development Fund that we have, that guarantees up to 75% of the women at least borrowing in the banks. With that, we have seen now the increase in the women borrowing money for their own businesses, and this has contributed to development in the whole country. I could go on to so many other laws that have been put in place, including the labor law that was really reformed, that has encouraged more women to come up, supplemented by the maternity leave, of course, law that has been also put in place to make sure that this time, in the private sector especially, they don't have any reason not to hire the women and retain women because of that kind of facility, which has been very, very useful. But also seen so many others, gender-based violence laws that are there. But above all, I think what was very, very important was the beginning of the Constitution, 2013, when we, in the Constitution, when it was incorporated that 30% at least of women have to be in all decision-making organs of the country. And that was a very good beginning. And that's why you see these numbers that we are talking about, of 64% women in parliament, of over 50% women in government, but also in judiciary, and so many others, like 80%, especially with the vice mayors, it's 80% over the whole country. This becomes very, very useful for us, because once they are there, they are the ones also who participate in decision making, especially where it matters, in policies, in laws, and also advising the government, I would say. So it has been quite useful, and we are seeing the results, which is encouraging for us.
Right. Kalpana, I want to bring you in onto this because you've written extensively on this particular matter. He's mentioned a particular issue of women and, yes, financial inclusion, access to credit ultimately. Is there a correlation between bridging the gender gap and access to finance and financial inclusion for women as it is?
So, as you know, the IMF has done a lot of research on this, and we find that closing the gap on financial inclusion is actually very beneficial to women's economic participation. But more than that, it has a boost to growth, it has a boost to corporate profits, it has a boost to, in fact, financial stability even. The fact that more women participate in high levels in corporations and so on. So there's no doubt that closing the gap in financial inclusion, and one of the biggest sources of inequity in financial inclusion was access to collateral. So I completely agree with the Minister that this was probably one key measure that helped level the playing field for women.
Right. If at all we're to go back to some of the cardinal points that the UN has been concentrating on over the years, one of them is education. Now, some literature would suggest that if at all education for women, for girls from an early age is tackled, then the gender gap will be ultimately also worked on. Is this a notion that UN Women is actually cardinal to and very vocal about?
Indeed. And the good thing about the work that UN Women does is that the first thing is to mainstream gender into all sectors. So while we may not be experts in all the sectors, our expertise is gender. So in the education sector, we have found that where you don't give equal access to boys and girls, you're actually starting by discriminating against the girl child. For example, in Rwanda, we have 64% of women in parliament. They all have an education. If they didn't have an education, because there's a basic level of education that entitles you to be bold enough to say you want to contest for a parliamentary seat. Therefore, if you don't educate the girl child, already she doesn't have a space to compete. So girls' education is cardinal. Girls' education is extremely important. I wanted to also add to what the Minister and my sister said about the gender gaps. In the agricultural sector, women are the producers. Across Africa, about 80%. Yet, when you look at agribusiness, only about 24% of women are in agribusiness. So UN Women did a study to find out what's the cost of gender gap in agriculture. And what we found is that when you don't give women access to seeds, you don't give them access to tools. I mean, when you have tractors, you give to the men, right? The women still use the hoe. So when you don't give them access to seeds, you don't give them access to tools, you don't give them access to modern technology, then what you find is there is a gap that is in millions of dollars for each country. So if you increase the access for women in agriculture, you move them into agribusiness, and the whole country benefits from that in sustainable development.
Very interesting. Kalpana, I'm very sure you want to add to that particular one.
Well, let me just add in a slightly different way. What our research shows is that closing the gender gaps actually contributes to economic diversification. So what we find is that economies are more diversified. What does that mean? It means that they draw they're growing on the basis of several sectors growing, which makes it more stable, the growth. And there's a very strong correlation between closing gender gaps in participation rates and economic diversification.
Honorable, whenever we talk, it's definitely on the fiscal end of things, but it's very interesting. Much of the research is again pointing towards having the right policy mix, at least from the fiscal front. If you have the policy mix correct, then definitely the gender gap can also be bridged. How is Rwanda managing to address this particular one? Because we are seeing dividends already.
Yeah, what we did is, first of all, when you're looking at the economic growth, you're looking at the agriculture, you're looking at the industry, you're looking at the services. In those areas, it depends on what we invest into that. And as a government, we use only the budget tool to be able to orient, of course, the policy implementation. And that's why we have the gender responsive budgeting. That gender responsive budgeting cuts across all sectors, in all projects, to make sure that that element of gender, which is now compulsory because it's by law, that it has to accompany. It's an attachment that you put on the budget, the budget framework paper. When you go to present the budget, it's also analyzed as part of the budget. And also when you are also following up in terms of implementation of the budget, also we give a report on the progress of how is that one taking shape. We also look at it in many various projects to make sure that they're also gender inclusive. And that's the only way you can monitor, because that's the only tool of government. But at the same time, we monitor because you're in charge of the policy in general. If it is financial sector, if it's economic sector, whatever sector, then you have to see, because our partners is private sector, is civil society. How is that one also contributing? What our sister says is that in agriculture, for example, right from the production, the whole value chain up to the processing level, where do we see the gap? And why is that? And that's why the information becomes very useful, to know exactly where there is a gap, analyze what the causes of that kind of gap, and then as the policymakers, you take decisions accordingly. You can use many tools, including incentives, to make sure that that gap can be closed. But we need to get information first. The issue of believing in it, in Rwanda we believe in it, there's total leadership and ownership, but then without information that would inform the policy decision, then it becomes a problem. And that's why we think that the more information you get, the better for us to be able to slowly by slowly close the gap.
Isadora, I see you agree, definitely.
As UN Women, we've decided that gender statistics is the way to go. Yeah. So gender statistics, we have a flagship, which we call Making Every Woman and Girl Count. And in there, we're looking at policies. We're looking at what the reasons are for the gap. We're looking at what other countries like Rwanda have done. How can we borrow from that? And we're looking at what solutions, working together with institutional financial institutions like the IMF to look at inclusivity and financial inclusivity to ensure that the right policies are put in place. And I agree with the minister that without data, you can't change policy. Therefore, we are engaging and investing, working together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Data2X, several partners who are interested in looking at gender data so that we are not just talking from emotions, we are talking from evidence.
I like that. Kalfan, I want to bring you in. There are two schools of thought. Some argue that maybe quotas are the way to go, at least on the executive boards. And again, you have been very, very vocal about this particular one. Where's your stand? And maybe also on behalf of the IMF on this particular one. Quotas or no quotas?
So let me just maybe not give you a one-word answer, but in the IMF, we have targets, we have benchmarks for this is for within the IMF, for not only for women's representation amongst the staff and leadership, but also for representation of what we call underrepresented nationalities, because we truly believe that the staff of the IMF have to reflect the membership, have to look like the membership of the IMF. So in our case, we believe that having those quotas or having those benchmarks, and they're not called quotas, they're called benchmarks, has really helped us. The whole philosophy is what gets measured gets done. And I think actually the example of Rwanda is a great one. I mean, they set a quota, and actually now they've far exceeded that quota. And I'm going to venture to say it's because people see that having women, 30%, 40% is that they're actually effective. They're good administrators. They're good parliamentarians. They're good policymakers. And so, in fact, the quota now is no longer even relevant.
My biggest worry might be that on the public hand, this is really looking good. But if we were to look at the FTSE 100 companies, there's, well, by 2016, there was only 7 women CEOs. And on the private end of things, we are yet to maybe replicate what has been achieved on the public end. I want to bring you in here, Honorable Minister. What could be the prescription, at least, what going forward?
Well, this is a journey. You cannot really achieve everything at once. At least even having those CEOs is progress in itself. And this is not something that can be fixed in a short time. It will take time because it's mindset change. And that mindset change in every country, in every organization, it takes time. But I think the more we share the progress, the better. Because some companies, you see like some that are leading like Unilever, have shown that it can work for them and they can make profit. And having some good examples of success stories in the private sector, in the public sector, in the civil society, then these would be like role models that would encourage others. So it's a journey. The first thing is for us to believe in it, to make sure that for us this is a movement that we can create that really cuts across all the sectors. When in Rwanda initially, it was just a gender issue, for the ministry. But now in our economic cluster, where the ministries get together and discuss, talking about education, the health and other sectors, they talk about gender. In the economic cluster, which I chair, with so many other institutions, we talk about gender. In the governance cluster, they talk about gender. Meaning it's no longer the ministry, it's country-owned. They can only do the coordination and put the whole picture together, but at least everyone also monitors. Every minister monitors their own areas. Every governor of the province also does the same thing. Other institutions, like the central bank, they have to make sure that these numbers are well disaggregated, and then they know this is the policy of the government, and they have to follow up, understand why, what is happening. The same thing as statistics, which is putting the data together in every sector. They just say how many men, how many women. And then once they give us these statistics, as my sister mentioned, then we can say, oh, something's wrong here. We need to fix something. And then we sit down and discuss it either in social cluster, governance cluster, or economic cluster. And then before we take it to cabinet. So that's why we are saying is that really whatever happens, it's progress, it's a journey. It's not something that can be fixed in a day or two, because initially we are not even talking about it. At least now we are talking about it, and we have some examples, and we have some willing partners who are coming on board.
Isadora, definitely one of the willing partners here is UN Women. What do you say to that statistic? 7 of the FTSE 100 company CEOs are the women, the other 93 men. This is by 2016.
Watch us by 2020.
That's interesting.
Watch us by 2020. You know, what we are dealing with here is also an issue of patriarchy. And it's not just patriarchy addressing men, even getting women to aspire to be heads of boards and CEOs takes getting out of their comfort zones and getting out of their shells. Even getting them to dare to even become heads of institutions takes a lot, because the community, as we have been socialized, does not appreciate and allow women to actually get out there. So as the minister said, it's a journey, it's progress, and we're beginning to see role models. So once the younger people, once other people see women sitting down as heads of organizations, as chairs of boards, and they're doing well, that's the issue. Once you are there and you are showing success and you are showing that it's possible, then you have other people venturing into that. So and that's what UN Women is doing. We are addressing social norms, we are addressing customary practices, we are addressing patriarchy that have been there institutionally for over years to try and truncate the advancement of women.
Right. Kalpana, if we are to...
Also, maybe if I can add, see, the biggest issue that we have faced here is really the mentality. Just let me give you just one simple example. When I was working for UNDP here, where I started working as a national economist, then I wanted to go to the rural area to see my parents. And I had some relatives that we had to go with. I had the car, and then I said, I can give you a lift. And they all went out because they wanted to pack the things in the car. My driver was a woman. And then, of course, surprisingly, they came back saying, are we going? I said, yes. He said, but the driver is a woman. I said, what's wrong with that? But you could see that even at the family level, at even the lowest level, the perception is that a woman cannot drive. When you reach in the rural areas, the whole village came to see that there is a woman who is driving. And that was like a big thing. And this is in our own home, the cattle keepers and all that, they had never seen a woman driving. So it's like, can this be true? But now, nobody talks about anything, because even women drive themselves everywhere in the rural areas, let alone even being a driver.
I was going to top up, because the IMF's representative here, Alan Thomas, he also has a lady for a driver. So yes, clearly IMF is also setting a standard here very high.
And that surely will be something that's reported back when we go back to Washington.
Honorable Gatete, I want to ask you about the leadership. His Excellency Paul Kagame was once quoted saying that if oppressed women were to wage a war, I would smuggle the weapons to them. So he's clearly someone who is he for she, definitely, to borrow the tagline of the UN. How essential is leadership towards bridging the gap?
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I come to that, I just wanted to compliment what my sisters have just said. For us, the Institute of Statistics is very, very important, especially when it comes to income distribution, looking at the inequality that we are talking about. And here, we compare so many things. We compare the GDP per capita. We also compare the Human Development Index, the Gender-Related Development Index, the Human Poverty Index. And once you bring in the data, and you can segregate it by district, by sectors, then you'd know exactly where the intervention should be. And this becomes very critical because it includes the gender element. So you cannot just say in general terms, this is the inequality. You have to go deep and say, what does that mean? What does that mean in this district? What does it mean in the province? What does it mean in the different categories? And this informs us in different ways because you also go to the age groups, from early childhood development all the way up. And then from there you can know which measures to intervene. For us who are in charge of planning and finance, then in the planning process, we have to know exactly what to include and where to focus. And in the finance, we have to make sure that the money goes where there are bigger issues. So it really complements each other. But this would not have happened without the leadership. I can tell you that we are lucky in Rwanda. Right from the word go, the president was ahead of all of us in terms of setting the standards, in terms of setting the stage for really advocating the importance of gender. Because a long time ago, a woman in Rwanda would have to ask permission from either the husband or your uncle to open a bank account for your money. But now, they are the ones leading. Those things are like history. You know, it's not a long time ago. But because of his leadership, in all sectors, not just saying it, but also doing it and demanding results in every sector, it has helped us. But I'm saying leadership matters in all aspects. And once it starts from the top, it goes to all lower levels of leadership, then really it catches up very quickly. And that's why sensitization at the top level becomes very critical. You must believe it in order to actually follow up in terms of implementation.
Right. Kalpana, the issue of leadership, I know Madame Lagarde is very vocal about gender issues. Maybe if you want to top up on that.
Yeah, I must say she challenged us in 2013 when we first began doing work on, you know, when the global economy was struggling to recover and create jobs. She challenged us to think about what was holding back job creation. And when we did do the paper, I remember the first draft, she said, why aren't we talking specifically about women, or don't women face different issues? And, you know, it was the first time somebody had asked us a question like that, and that challenged us to do the work. That was only 3 or 4 years ago, and I would say now there's a strong coalition of the willing in the institution to continue meeting the challenge that she set. And not only, I mean, internally, of course, she's shown she's an incredible leader, but also challenging us to be out front on this issue.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I know it feels like we just started 5 minutes ago, but parting shots, everyone. Isidore, let me just start with you. What is the biggest challenge? Maybe all of you could answer this one. The biggest challenge to bridging the gap, at least for sub-Saharan Africa. We know Rwanda has done it, but it's not necessarily a copy and paste issue. What is the biggest challenge? What is holding
cultural
back?
norms and gender stereotypes? Because whatever it is we do for women, if we don't address and challenge cultural norms that continue to socialize us to think women are inferior, they are second citizen, they are second rate, they can't do particular jobs, they can't do particular professions. If we don't address those, we're not going anywhere.
But how do you move away from the culture? Just take, for instance, yesterday, Burundi, they announced that women are no longer allowed, a law passed, women are no longer allowed to beat the drum. And again, this is going with the side of culture. But one might argue this is our culture. How do we change that narrative?
This is our culture is whose narrative? I don't see cultural laws, I see cultural practices. And these are passed down. So we need to change that narrative, because it's just a ploy for those who have power, and I'm not going to call the gender, to continue to hold on to power. So if we don't challenge that and grow our kids up to say you were born equal, boy and girl, therefore you should have equal opportunities, whatever you want to aspire to be. If a girl decides, you know what, I want to drive a truck, she should be allowed to do it. If she decides, I want to be building roads, why not? So we must address that.
I know, Kalpana, you're dying to...
I am trying. I I think one of the things that we've learned in our work is that we do have to be sensitive to the culture of the country when we go and discuss policy issues. But I take heart from something that's been happening even in countries like the Middle East. Saudi Arabia stands out as one, and I dare say that it's the economic imperative that's causing, that can also help cause cultural change. In Saudi Arabia, we have a leadership there that's looking to see what can be the future of Saudi Arabia when you know oil prices. I mean, to them, they realize that they have to look now into this untapped, you know, gold mine that they have in educated women, and how they can unleash their potential. Some might argue they're moving slowly, but they're moving. So I actually think that cultural norms can...
And Saudi women are now allowed to drive.
Finally, yes.
I mean, really.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is economics can help drive cultural change when it becomes really tough.
Honorable Gatete, you have the final say. What is the biggest challenge to bridging the gap?
Well, I think the leadership is very, very important. And leadership does not mean a president. It means all the leaders in their own responsibilities, including private sector leaders. And once you build that kind of network of the people who understand it the same way, it has a huge impact. You can have so many conferences, make the good statements, but if you don't build a national network of the people who think alike, who believe in it, then it won't work in terms of implementation. So the leadership is very, very critical before even you go to other areas in terms of taking decisions and all that. And the other thing also that is very, very important is including women in decision making. Because this time you cannot take a decision anywhere without the women being there. So once they are involved, then they also influence the decisions that have to be taken. So it's very, very critical that we have the women in different areas also among the decision makers.
Ladies and the gentlemen, many thanks again for making time to speak to us. I know it was very brief. I wish I could have the panel even longer. To my right, we have the International Monetary Fund's Human Resource Department's Director, that's Kalpana Kocha. Right next to her, we have Rwanda's Minister for Finance and Economic Planning, Ambassador Claver Gatete, and to my extreme right, we do have the United Nations Women Kenya representative and also the regional director. That's Isidore Derricks Briggs. That sums it up for this particular CNBC Africa special. I'm Arnold Segawa, talking gender and, of course, ways to bridge that gender gap. This is CNBC Africa, first in business worldwide.